The wind carried a smell of wet earth and burned oil across the empty French airfield. Dawn light slanted through the smoke, revealing a broken shape half buried in the mud. A Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, its silver skin torn open like a carcass left to cool. Steam hissed from the engine cowling where rain met metal still hot from flight. The once roaring machine now lay silent, but the silence felt deceptive, as if the monster had only paused to breathe. 3 Luftwaffe engineers approached slowly, boots sinking in the soft soil. Their coats whipped in the wind, notebooks clutched tight against the drizzle. They moved without speaking, circling the wreckage the way hunters might circle a lion they weren't sure was dead. One reached out and touched the metal, still warm. Beneath the mud and soot, the Thunderbolt's massive radial engine gleamed faintly, its cylinders arranged in defiant symmetry, its scale grotesque beside the elegant lines of German craft. This was no instrument of finesse. It was an anvil with wings. The men could feel its weight, not just in kilograms but in concept, an entire nation's philosophy condensed into steel and torque. Where Germany prized precision and scarcity, America had chosen abundance and power. The contrast was almost vulgar. One engineer whispered that the cowling alone weighed more than a Messerschmitt's wing. Another scribbled measurements, trying to fit the enormity of it into familiar equations, but the math refused to yield sense. The P-47's cockpit canopy hung open, fractured glass catching the dull light. Inside, dials and gauges crowded the panel, redundant and overbuilt. There was a gauge for everything: fuel pressure, manifold temperature, boost, and backup boost. To the German mind it was chaos. To the American, insurance. Every system duplicated, every risk anticipated. Efficiency had been sacrificed to survivability. Elegance replaced with excess. Yet it worked. The plane's pilot had bailed out miles away, alive. The engine, riddled with holes, had kept running until gravity alone brought it down. One of the men crouched by the propeller hub, tracing the bullet scars that barely dented its blades. He murmured that no European engine could take such punishment. Behind him the others stood silent, their breath visible in the chill air. In their eyes flickered something uneasy: admiration, envy, and fear all braided together. They were staring not at a wreck, but at a revelation. Proof that the war's balance might hinge not on genius, but on production lines. Rain thickened, drumming softly against the metal. The lead engineer snapped his notebook shut. There was nothing more to measure. The truth wasn't hidden in blueprints or metallurgy. It was in the philosophy of its making. He looked once more at the massive cylinders. Brutal, simple, unstoppable. What they saw that morning wasn't just an airplane. It was the future. And it didn't speak German. But to understand the weight of that moment on the tarmac, we must go back to the skies, where the P-47 first earned its fearsome reputation. At 25,000 feet, the world turned silver and blue, a place where breath froze in the mask before it reached the lungs. The air was thin, brittle, like the edge of a blade. Through that blade cut the shapes of 2 predators, a Messerschmitt Bf 109G climbing hard, and a distant shadow above it, heavy and fast, sunlight glinting off a broad wing. Oberleutnant Karl Fischer, veteran of the Eastern Front, squinted against the glare. His instruments trembled near the red line, engine whining as the Daimler-Benz roared in protest. The American up there, a Thunderbolt they said, was supposed to be slow, cumbersome, an overweight mistake of design. Yet the shape refused to yield. Instead, it began to dive. The dive came like thunder itself, a whistling scream that built into a solid roar. Fisher banked hard, expecting to see the American overshoot, but the P-47 didn't wobble. It plunged straight through the sky, engine howling with something unnatural, a mechanical growl too steady to be piston-borne. He dove after it, nose down, airspeed needle climbing. 400 miles per hour. 450. The 109 began to shudder, the stick vibrating in his gloves. He felt the wings strain, felt the air thickening into resistance. The American, impossibly, was still accelerating. At 480 miles per hour, Fisher's world turned into chaos. Rattles, shrieks, warning lights. The Thunderbolt pulled up effortlessly, leaving contrails like scars across the sky. Fisher's breath caught. How could something so large dive faster than the most refined machine Germany had ever built? He leveled out, engine coughing, oil temperature rising. The American leveled too, far ahead, and banked gently into the sun. For a moment, its broad silhouette looked like an eagle shrugging off a bullet. That evening, back at their French base, the pilots tried to make sense of it. "It's absurd," one said. "A tractor with wings." Another swore he saw bullets spark off its fuselage without effect. Fisher remained quiet. He remembered the sound. That constant, confident roar of a 2,000-horsepower engine that didn't seem to care about physics. The Thunderbolt wasn't nimble. It didn't need to be. It fought gravity itself, and won. Luftwaffe doctrine had always favored grace. Light airframes, instantaneous roll rates, delicate control. The Bf-109 was a rapier. One cut, precise and clean. The Thunderbolt was a hammer. It didn't slice, it crushed. While the German engine strained for performance within fractions, the American engine simply demanded more fuel, more air, more metal. The design philosophy wasn't finesse, it was audacity. Reports poured in through the summer of 1943. Pilots spoke of duels that defied their training. P-47's absorbing cannon fire, trailing smoke yet clawing upward again. Others described Thunderbolts plunging from high altitude, tearing through bomber formations, then vanishing into cloud cover with a speed no German aircraft could match. Some commanders dismissed these as exaggerations born of fatigue. But the wreckage told another story. In July, a downed Thunderbolt was recovered in northern France. The airframe was twisted, riddled with 20mm holes. And yet the engine, though scorched, was intact. The recovery team gathered around it the way priests might gather around a relic. Even in ruin, the machine looked defiant. Its radial cylinders sat in two perfect rings, a mechanical cathedral built not for beauty, but for endurance. Fisher visited the site. He ran his gloved hand across the scorched cowling, recalling the sound that had haunted him above the clouds. What he had seen that day wasn't just a new aircraft. It was a declaration that the enemy had shifted from precision to power, from art to industry. The reports reached the RLM in Berlin, and soon a team of engineers was dispatched to examine the monster themselves. The hangar near Reims smelled of fuel, damp canvas, and cold metal. Floodlights glared against the walls, throwing long shadows across the concrete floor where the captured P-47 waited like a specimen on an operating table. Outside, the wind carried the distant rumble of artillery, but inside there was only silence, the kind reserved for things that command respect. The German engineers moved with the precision of surgeons. A mechanic loosened bolts from the cowling, each one coming away reluctantly, as if the machine resented being opened. When the final panel lifted free, the engine emerged. Immense, gleaming even through soot, a mechanical labyrinth that seemed to pulse with its own defiance. 18 cylinders in 2 concentric rings, a web of pipes, filters, and cooling vanes. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp. They circled it slowly. Not a word was wasted. One man measured the cylinder spacing. Another traced the fuel injection lines that wound through the mass like arteries. They spoke in murmurs, in half-sentences and numbers. 72 millimeters wider than the BMW 801. Compression ratio, lower but the boost compensates. Two-stage supercharger, liquid intercooler, incredible. The lead engineer, a veteran of Daimler-Benz's DB605 project, simply stared. To him it was both magnificent and absurd. He admired its power yet bristled at its philosophy. The German engine was elegant, narrow, light, a masterpiece of form obeying function. This, by comparison, looked brutal, overbuilt, unrefined. But as he studied further, the criticism gave way to understanding. Every part was designed for endurance, not grace. Bearings oversized, cooling fins thick, fuel lines redundant. It wasn't a machine built by an engineer's ego. It was built by a nation determined to keep flying no matter the cost. One assistant unscrewed a manifold plate, revealing the heart of the system, the two-stage supercharger. The Germans leaned closer, astonished by the complexity. The Americans had built an air pump that defied logic, feeding the engine with compressed air at altitudes where others gasped for breath. To replicate it would require alloys Germany no longer possessed, factories no longer safe from bombers, and a scale of production they could only dream of. They continued for hours, dismantling, sketching, weighing. Every discovery carried a sting of admiration. The double wasp was not superior because it was clever. It was superior because it could be made in thousands, each one identical, each one forgiving of imperfection. Where the German craftsmen sought perfection, the American system sought consistency. By evening, the hangar floor was littered with panels and tools. The engineers stood among the pieces of the beast, their notebooks filled but their confidence hollowed. One of them whispered, half in jest, half in defeat, "It's not an airplane engine. It's an industrial engine that happens to fly." The others said nothing. As they covered the disassembled engine with a tarp, the lead engineer looked back once. Metal reflected light like a sleeping eye. But engineering isn't just metal. It's a reflection of doctrine. And doctrine, in 1943, was steering Germany toward a dead end. In the weeks after the teardown, the hangar near Reims became a quiet temple of reckoning. Each engineer returned to his desk with notes that felt less like triumphs and more like confessions. The reports they drafted were filled with admiration disguised as technical language. Torque figures, compression ratios, heat tolerances. But beneath the numbers ran a silent admission. We cannot build this. One evening, under the flicker of kerosene lamps, the team gathered in a drafty office to summarize their findings. Sheets of calculations lay scattered across the table. The lead engineer from Daimler-Benz, Dr. Kruger, pinched the bridge of his nose. "You see," he said, tapping the drawing of the double wasp, "they designed for abundance. We designed for scarcity." A younger man frowned. "But that's inefficiency." "No," Kruger replied, his voice low, weary. "It's insurance. They build for the worst day, not the best." Outside, the wind rattled the windows, carrying with it the distant thunder of Allied bombers, a nightly reminder of whose industry truly ruled the skies. Germany's doctrine had been forged in precision. Every aircraft was an artwork, tuned to the edge of perfection, optimized for pilots of rare skill. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Focke-Wulf 190, masterpieces of balance and performance. But masterpieces demanded artisans. They demanded resources, time, purity of alloy. And time was the one element Germany no longer possessed. In contrast, America's factories thrummed day and night, indifferent to artistry. At Pratt & Whitney's plant in East Hartford, engines rolled from assembly lines by the hundreds. Machines tested, adjusted, and mounted. Not by elite craftsmen, but by trained workers repeating exact motions under fluorescent light. Their perfection came not from genius, but from process, each bolt identical, each measurement standardized. The result wasn't beauty, it was reliability. An army of engines that never varied, never failed, never waited. Inside Germany, the opposite was true. The Reich's industrial system was fragmented by politics and pride. BMW competing with Daimler-Benz, Junkers withholding blueprints from Messerschmitt, each guarding secrets like a duelist protecting his blade. Supply lines frayed under Allied bombing. Alloys were rationed. Machinists were replaced with forced laborers who had neither training nor loyalty. Kruger looked again at the schematic of the P-47 engine. "Our DB-605, he said quietly, "is like a violin. This," he gestured to the radial monster on paper, "is a drum. You can drop it, and it still plays." A murmur of reluctant agreement filled the room. They knew the truth but couldn't speak it aloud in reports. To admit that the enemy's strength came not from brilliance, but from democracy, from sheer organization and scale, was to admit that Germany's own ideology was its flaw. Outside the office, the war was accelerating toward entropy. Factories relocated underground, supply chains bent and snapped. Each month brought new restrictions, new shortages. The Luftwaffe's finest designs grew lighter, faster, but also thinner, more fragile, a reflection of the nation itself. Elegant, doomed. Meanwhile, Allied bombers grew fatter, tougher, escorted by Thunderbolts whose engines never faltered. Every destroyed aircraft on the German side was a singular loss. Every destroyed Thunderbolt was immediately replaced. The arithmetic was merciless. Later that night, one engineer lingered alone in the hangar, staring at the disassembled R-2800 under its tarp. He thought of the thousands of identical engines beating in rhythm across the Atlantic, each one a pulse in a larger industrial heart. He whispered to himself, "We can build one masterpiece. They can build 10 machines that never quit," and in that whisper lay the fracture between doctrine and reality, the moment when brilliance realized it could not outpace simplicity. Yet even within the German ranks, there were whispers. Could the Thunderbolt's secrets be adapted, weaponized, made German? By 1944, imitation had become a form of survival. In a makeshift laboratory beneath the shattered shell of a BMW facility near Munich, engineers huddled around a prototype compressor rig assembled from scavenged parts. The air smelled of oil and dust. The ceiling trembled with each distant bombing raid. They were trying to recreate the American miracle, the two-stage turbo-supercharger of the P-47. A turbine whined to life, high-pitched and nervous. Gauges flickered. The engineers watched as pressure climbed, their pencils poised over log sheets. For a few seconds it held steady. Then a sharp crack split the air. The test stand shuddered violently. Fragments of metal clattered across the floor. A blade had failed again. The lead mechanic, his face blackened with soot, swore softly in Bavarian. There was no chromium left for heat-resistant alloys, no nickel for turbine strength. Every experiment ended the same way, potential devoured by scarcity. They patched what they could, substituting cheaper metals, reinforcing weak points, pushing the limits of physics and patience. Each failure was studied, sketched, and repeated. But progress was an illusion. Turbo-supercharging demanded precision machining, exotic metals, high-octane fuel, all things the Reich could no longer supply. What had once been an empire of industry was now scavenging the bones of its own collapse. At Junkers, similar trials unfolded underground. Engineers in threadbare coats worked by candlelight, oxygen masks hanging around their necks like relics of another era, their notebooks filled with desperate arithmetic, temperatures, pressures, tolerances that couldn't be met. The few working prototypes overheated within minutes. Bearings seized, turbine blades warped like wax under a flame. Someone remarked that the Americans must have made a pact with the devil to keep those engines alive at altitude. The others laughed, but without humor. Contrast defined their existence. Across the ocean, American engineers at Pratt & Whitney ran controlled tests under stable power and cool air. Their failures became blueprints for refinement. The Germans' failures became ashes on the floor. Ingenuity was all they had left, but ingenuity without material was like theory without breath. Still, they persisted. Pride drove them as much as patriotism. They admired the double wasp even as it mocked them, its robust design a mirror of everything they were denied. They dreamt of adapting its principles, a high-durability radial with multi-stage boost, perhaps for the next Focke-Wulf variant. But each drawing ended the same way, a margin note reading, "Materials unavailable." One evening, after another compressor test disintegrated in a shriek of torn metal, an exhausted engineer stared into the ruined turbine. "They build in abundance," he muttered. "We build in ruins." His assistant said nothing. The lights flickered as bombs fell somewhere beyond the city. In that moment, imitation ceased to be engineering. It became archaeology, studying the remains of a civilization that had already surpassed them. And then came the battlefield proof. The moment the P-47's power wasn't theoretical anymore, but a thunderclap over the Reich. The clouds over western Germany were black with flak. Shell bursts bloomed like dark flowers against the winter sky, tracing the path of the incoming bombers. Below, German crews loaded another belt into the 88s, their hands raw and trembling from the cold. The rumble of engines grew from a distant tremor to a sky-filling roar. Hundreds of B-17s pushing east under escort. And there, darting among them like armored hornets, came the new arrivals. The P-47 Thunderbolts. Captain Bill McGraw of the 56th Fighter Group adjusted his oxygen mask and leaned forward against the harness. The formation ahead shimmered with tracer fire. He could feel the vibrations of the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 through the seat. A deep, confident growl, steady even as flak rocked the sky. The engine didn't flinch. It was like flying with a heartbeat made of iron. "Bandits, 11 o'clock, came the call. McGraw pushed the throttle. The Thunderbolt surged forward, a mass of aluminum and willpower. A Messerschmitt cut through the formation, spitting cannon fire. McGraw dove. The world turned into speed and pressure. The air screamed against the fuselage as he dropped nearly 2 miles in seconds, the altimeter spinning madly. Below, the German pilot tried to follow, but his Bf-109 began to shake, wings quivering at the edge of control. The P-47 plunged faster, its radial engine roaring in triumph. When McGraw pulled out of the dive, his body crushed against the seat, vision narrowing. Oil streamed across the canopy. His engine had taken hits, but it kept running. The temperature needles danced red, yet the double wasp refused to die. He banked hard, fired a short burst. Tracers caught the 109's wing. A flash, a plume, then nothing but falling debris. On the ground, a flak crew watched in disbelief as another Thunderbolt, smoking from 3 direct hits, leveled out and vanished into the clouds. "Unzerstörbar," one of them muttered. Indestructible. They had been told the Americans built heavy machines, but no one imagined something that could shrug off fire the way a battleship shrugged off rain. By late 1943, the Thunderbolt was more than an escort. It had become a symbol of relentless presence. Pilots began modifying drop tanks for longer range, carrying bombs and rockets for ground attack. What had begun as a defensive guardian evolved into a strike hammer, proof of an air force unafraid to reinvent itself mid-war. Germany's doctrine, rigid and hierarchical, had no answer for that fluidity. Over the Ruhr Valley, Thunderbolts screamed down upon rail yards and convoys, their engines glowing with heat. Cylinders cracked, paint blistered, yet they kept diving, delivering punishment with mechanical indifference. German soldiers fired upward, watching sparks leap from the Americans' armor. The planes seemed alive, wounded but unyielding, creatures of noise and fire. Back at base, McGraw stepped from his P-47, the engine ticking as it cooled, oil dripping onto the concrete. He looked at the holes stitched across the cowling, the ragged edges of metal around the cooling vents. Mechanics would replace the panels. The heart, though, still beat strong. "She'll fly again tomorrow," he said simply. For the men who fought below those clouds, the difference between doctrine and adaptation had become more than theory. It was survival. Germany still believed wars were won by perfection. America had learned they were won by persistence. In Berlin, the engineers watched the same newsreels, and the silence in the hangar turned to something heavier than awe: resignation. The report was finished at dawn. The men in the Ram's hangar sat in silence, the kind of silence that belongs not to exhaustion, but to understanding. Sheets of calculations and sketches covered the table. Ratios, stress curves, metallurgical analyses. Yet no number could disguise the conclusion written in a single, careful sentence: replication impractical under current industrial conditions. Dr. Kruger signed the page without hesitation. His pen scratched against the paper like a confession. Around him, the other engineers avoided eye contact. They had all known what the data would say. Now it was simply official. The double wasp could be measured, copied, even diagrammed, but it could not be recreated. Not in this Germany, not under these skies. A junior technician broke the quiet. "It's not impossible," he said, voice thin, defiant. "If we had the alloys, the fuel—" Kruger cut him off with a weary smile. "And if the moon were made of nickel, we might build a fleet of them." The men chuckled softly, but no one looked amused. Outside, the airfield was gray with frost. The war was moving north and east, closer every day. He rose and walked to the covered engine. Pulling back the tarp, he stared once more at the P-47's heart. Even disassembled, it radiated power, heavy, unashamed, efficient in its excess. He placed a hand on one of the cooling fins. "They build," he murmured, "as if material were infinite." That line would echo through the final report, repeated by every engineer who signed it. It was more than a technical observation. It was a statement of defeat. The American strength wasn't just industrial. It was philosophical. Where Germany had designed for constraint, America had designed for possibility. One culture trimmed to survive scarcity, the other expanded to embrace abundance. Kruger thought of the factories he had toured in the 1930s. Spotless, methodical, proud. Then he imagined the American plants he had seen in photographs. Immense halls filled with rows of women and men, machines humming in unison, parts stacked to the rafters. Not artisans but citizens, each contributing to something larger than themselves. That was the difference. That was the weapon Germany could not match. He felt no bitterness toward the enemy, only a quiet respect. These engineers were not villains or fools. They were craftsmen imprisoned by a collapsing empire, forced to chase perfection while their rivals perfected production. As the others packed their instruments, Kruger folded the report, sealed it in its folder, and paused. "Genius," he said softly, "is meaningless without momentum." No one replied. They didn't need to. Outside, the wind stirred the tarp again, exposing a glimpse of the R-2800's gleaming steel. It looked almost alive, patient, waiting. But while Germany's engineers bowed to limitation, the Americans were already asking a new question. How far can this power go? In America, the heartbeat of war wasn't the roar of engines in combat, it was the rhythm of factories. Across the continent, from Connecticut to California, the thunder of presses and drills filled the air like a national drumbeat. The R-2800 wasn't just an engine anymore. It had become a pattern, a modular masterpiece that multiplied itself across designs and doctrines. On assembly lines in East Hartford, women in bandanas and men in overalls worked side by side, fitting pistons, tightening bolts, testing spark plugs. Every part fit into another, like sentences in a shared language. The Double Wasp found new lives everywhere. It powered the F-4U Corsair as it screamed off carrier decks into the Pacific. It lifted the F-6F Hellcat against the rising sun. It drove the P-61 Black Widow through the night skies of Europe. Each machine was different, yet their hearts beat in unison, a synchronized pulse of steel and confidence. The Americans hadn't just built engines, they had built a system that could teach itself to improve. Instructors in training schools explained not just how to repair the R-2800, but how to think about maintenance as strategy. Mechanics learned by repetition, guided by manuals that assumed every soldier could master complexity if given a process. Innovation was no longer a spark of genius. It was institutionalized curiosity. When something failed, the failure was cataloged, studied, corrected, and reissued across the system within weeks. Germany's engineers, by contrast, had lived in isolation, each design bureau a private kingdom, each success a matter of pride, not policy. The Americans saw the opposite truth. Progress wasn't personal. It was procedural. Their genius lay not in the brilliance of one inventor, but in the coordination of thousands, a doctrine of collaboration, not competition. Footage from wartime newsreels captured it perfectly. Rows of Thunderbolts lined up like soldiers awaiting baptism, engines tested in harmony, flames licking from exhaust stacks as inspectors checked gauges and signatures. No one designer claimed ownership. The machine belonged to everyone, and that was its strength. In that collective rhythm lay something profound. The P-47 story was no longer just about metal and horsepower. It was about a culture that trusted systems more than heroes. Precision through participation, excellence by design. Where the Germans built singular wonders, the Americans built reliability itself. The result was not a factory's triumph, but a civilization's. The industrial doctrine of the Allies turned creativity into infrastructure, ambition into repetition, individuality into orchestra. The R-2800 became its anthem, loud, tireless, and utterly democratic. And when the war ended, the engineers who once studied their enemy's secrets faced an uncomfortable truth about the future of engineering itself. The war ended not with ceremony, but with silence. Hangars emptied, blueprints burned or hidden, machines left to rust in overgrown fields. In that silence, the surviving German engineers found themselves summoned, not to rebuild, but to explain. Allied intelligence teams questioned them in cold offices, surrounded by captured reports and photographs. The interrogations felt less like accusations and more like autopsies of an idea. Dr. Kruger sat across from an American officer who spoke fluent German and treated him with disarming courtesy. They discussed metallurgy, turbocharging, stress tolerances. At one point, the officer placed a photograph of the P-47's R-2800 engine on the table. "You studied this, didn't you?" he asked. Kruger nodded. "We did," he replied softly. "And we learned something we could not manufacture. Not the metal, not the freedom." Some of his colleagues were offered contracts, folded into Operation Paperclip, sent across the Atlantic to build for their former enemies. Others returned to what remained of their homes, working in factories that now made cars instead of fighters. Yet when they spoke privately, they spoke not of defeat, but of recognition. The Thunderbolt's heart had shown them a mirror, not of failure, but of what might have been if genius had been allowed to breathe instead of obey. One former Luftwaffe technician, when interviewed years later, put it in a single sentence: "They didn't outthink us, they outbuilt us." It was the simplest, most painful truth. The Americans had not conjured brilliance out of thin air. They had liberated it through pragmatism. Every experiment allowed, every mistake absorbed, every hand part of the process. That was what tyranny could never replicate: the freedom to fail forward. To these men, the P-47's engine came to symbolize more than power. It was proof that innovation thrived where fear did not. They could appreciate it now, stripped of ideology, as engineers admiring an impossible instrument. Its excess no longer offended them. It humbled them. And so in the ruins of one world and the birth of another, admiration replaced rivalry. But even as these men rebuilt their lives, one question lingered: what ultimately gives a machine its soul? History remembers machines by their numbers: thrust, speed, altitude. But their true measure lies in what they represent. The R-2800, once just an engine of war, became something larger, a symbol of how strength born from collaboration outlives strength born from fear. It powered victory not through brilliance alone, but through unity. Thousands of hands turning bolts, minds refining designs, a nation believing that reliability was its own kind of heroism. As decades passed, the world moved from propellers to jets, from radial pistons to turbine blades. Yet in the gleaming hearts of modern engines, the same philosophy endures: overbuild where it matters, simplify where it doesn't, trust the system more than the individual. Every civilian airliner that crosses oceans today carries in its lineage a trace of that wartime lesson. That resilience, once institutionalized, becomes peace in motion. Germany's engineers would later acknowledge it quietly. In interviews and essays, they had chased perfection, the single flawless machine, and found themselves outpaced by a culture that valued adaptation over artistry. Isolation had built them masterpieces. Cooperation had built their conquerors. The difference was moral as much as mechanical. One ideology demanded obedience to authority. The other trusted the ordinary worker with a piece of the extraordinary. The old footage fades. Factories now museums. Bombers now monuments. The once feared Thunderbolt resting in hangars, its skin dull with age but its name still carrying weight. We return at last to the image that began it all: a German engineer standing beside the captured P-47 on that cold French airfield. His hand rests on the cowling, not in envy but in understanding. He is no longer an enemy, only a man confronting a truth that transcended victory or defeat. He whispers to no one, as the wind moves across the tarmac: it was never about horsepower. The engine beneath his palm is silent now, but its lesson still hums through time. Power, after all, is not a measure of output. It is a reflection of the hands that build it, the system that sustains it, and the faith that directs it. In war, the mightiest engine is not the one with the most horsepower, but the one built on the broadest shoulders.